Welcome back to Fundamentals of Philosophy. This is Module 6 on ethics. So, we've seen how Socrates viewed philosophy as a fundamentally ethical form of engagement with life, with the world, right? One that was ultimately, in his case, worth dying for, which he did. The unexamined life is not worth living. Russell, Semmelweis, and Descartes, they all similarly were willing to put themselves at risk rather than compromise their ethical principles. So, what sort of thing is an ethical principle then? We've seen that the deterministic clockwork of the universe creates some problems for our understanding of moral responsibility and agency. We talked about that in the last module. Either we're immaterial ghosts, right, trapped inside the Cartesian theater and excluded from actually acting in the world, or we're material bodies that must obey the same sort of causal scripts as any other bits of matter. There's a memorable passage from, I don't know if you guys read Terry Pratchett, who wrote the Discworld books, and if you don't, you should, because they're great books, they're very philosophical and very funny. And he wrote a book called Hogfather, which has a memorable passage which I think summarizes this dilemma well. So, let's take a listen.
All right, said Susan, I'm not stupid. You're saying humans need fantasies to make life bearable. Really? As if it was some kind of pink pill? No, humans need fantasy to be human. To be the place where the falling angel meets the rising ape. Tooth fairies, hogfathers, little... Yes, as practice you have to start out learning how to believe the little lies. So we can believe the big ones? Yes. Justice, mercy, duty, that sort of thing. They're not the same at all. You think so? Then take the universe and grind it down to the finest powder and sieve it through the finest sieve, and then show me one atom of justice, one molecule of mercy. And yet, Death waved a hand, and yet you act as if there is some ideal order in the world, as if there is some rightness in the universe by which it may be judged. Yes, but people have got to believe that, or what's the point? My point exactly.
So we live in a world that's shaped by our ethical intuitions and by moral imperatives, right? And yet when we peek beyond the edges of our little human world of oughts and musts and things, we see what Thomas Hobbes, and we'll talk about him more in the next module, calls the state of nature. Nature, red in tooth and claw, characterized by seemingly random patterns of fortune and suffering. And you can pull the camera back even farther and view the vast darkness beyond our little pale blue dot here. Do moral principles extend beyond the boundaries of our planet? Is there something that it's like to be a moral supernova or an ethical black hole? It's a question of whether morality is something that is a human invention, whether it's a construct, or whether it's something that exists objectively out there in the world, in nature, in the universe. And this is the meta-ethical problem of moral realism versus moral anti-realism. So what does that mean? The moral realist is someone who believes that there is something objective and universal that grounds our moral intuitions. That if humans were to disappear tomorrow, there would still be some standard that judges actions as either moral or immoral. Moral facts, like the truth of mathematics, possess an existence that's independent of human culture or subjective preferences. But science doesn't discover any particles of justice. There's no field of morality that's pervading space-time. The universe appears fundamentally indifferent to human moral concerns, is the problem. From the perspective of the moral anti-realist, moral claims seem to simply express mistakes about what counts as an ontological fact. They're merely, when you state a moral claim, you're simply making an error. This is a view that's known as error theory. David Hume, once again, sums up the problem very well with what has become known as the is-ought problem, or more colorfully, Hume's guillotine. And it goes like this: we cannot, in principle, derive an ought from an is. So what does that mean? So in our readings, Julia Driver talks about two types of claims. So the claims about the world fall into two categories, right? There's descriptive claims, which describe how the world objectively is, and there are normative claims, which describe how the world ought to be. So the problem is that when you move from a descriptive to a normative claim, this represents an example of what's known as the naturalistic fallacy, right? It's an invalid inference from the fact that something is natural to that something then being moral, or to say that something is immoral because it's unnatural. But as Hume points out, you're not justified in making that move. You can't derive the ought from the is. You can't look at the way the world is, that descriptive claim, and you can't derive from that the normative claim about how the world should be, right? So if we can't read moral principles off of the natural world, where do they come from? I mean, we seem to experience moral convictions with remarkable force and clarity, at least I hope we do. We want to say that genocide really is wrong, that this represents more than a description of a psychological fact about our personal preferences. There's something objectively wrong about it. So how are we going to do this? We're going to start by looking at a few strategies that are available to the moral realist, and then we're going to consider some of the rebuttals of the moral anti-realist. So one of the traditional approaches to grounding morality is to ground it in divine authority, right? So if God exists as a perfect moral being, then it follows that divine commands provide the foundations for our objective morality. This approach has some advantage to it. It makes morality not merely objective, but universal. An act sanctioned by divine command is moral without exception. It holds for everyone, everywhere, all the time. However, as Stephen M. Kahn points out in our readings, this approach ultimately faces a paradox which originates in Plato, and you might have encountered it back in Module 1. It's known as the Euthyphro dilemma, or the Euthyphro problem. Is an action good because God wills it? Or does God will an action because it is good? That's the dilemma. And if we choose the first option, that an action is good because God wills it, then ethics, according to Kahn, seems to be purely arbitrary. It's just an appeal to authority. What makes an action good is that a powerful enough being says it's good. This is an extreme example of might makes right, right? If we choose the second horn of the dilemma, though, God wills an action because the action is good, then morality represents a standard that's independent of and more fundamental than divine will. God is recognizing and responding to this independent moral standard, but doesn't create it. So if objective morality isn't created by God, then you can't ground it in the divine, in this sense of divine authority. So if objective morality can't be grounded in divine authority, then where can it be grounded? Where do you find it? Well, maybe you can find it in reason. Maybe reason can offer an objective ground for ethical facts. Like divine command theory, ethical theories grounded in reason provide us a framework for moral facts that is both objective and universal. The problem is, reason offers us also at least two different contrasting strategies for how to do that, and they don't work that well together. We can either appeal to the consequences that follow from an action, or we can appeal to the intent that lies behind the action. And that's going to be a very important split for how people approach moral intuitions and think about these sorts of things for hundreds of years. And the view that it's the results of our action, the consequences that establish their moral worth, is known as consequentialism. And its most influential version is known as utilitarianism, which is probably the dominant moral theory today. If not among philosophers, then sort of just generally. So Jeremy Bentham was the guy who first established utilitarianism as a formal theory. But John Stuart Mill, who we're going to read for this module, is the one who developed its most influential formulation. He gets all the credit. Bentham did the work, but Mill gets the credit. So Mill, that's not entirely fair. Mill grounds his approach in what's called the greatest happiness principle, which states that one should always act to produce the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. I mean, that sounds pretty intuitive, right? And by happiness, what he's talking about is something that increases pleasure and reduces pain. So you want to produce the greatest amount of pleasure and the least amount of pain for everybody. And he's going to say that this goes beyond like a simple hedonistic interpretation, right? And he's going to do this by distinguishing between higher and lower pleasures. So higher pleasures involve uniquely human faculties like reason and emotion. Always comes back to reason, right? And lower pleasures, on the other hand, are going to represent basic physical sensations, something like sexual pleasure, for example. And to judge between these different types of pleasures, Mill is going to say you need to have experience with both kinds, right? And those who have experienced both, according to Mill, are going to prefer the intellectual pleasures, the higher pleasures, over the lower pleasures. And he's got a great quote in our reading about this, which is that it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. That's famous. That's a famous quip, and that I think summarizes what Mill's getting at here. So his focus is on the greatest happiness for everyone, for all. And the moral worth of an action is ultimately going to be grounded in the degree to which it contributes to the creation of a world that contains more pleasure and less pain collectively. So on the whole, a world that has a greater quantity of pleasure is morally preferable to a world that has less pleasure and more pain. So there's basically two main branches of utilitarianism that have evolved from Mill's initial formulation. The first one's going to be act utilitarianism, which is the more strictly Millian interpretation. And that one evaluates individual actions based on their direct consequences. The moral value of an act is determined by how much pleasure or pain it produces in the world, sort of as a quantity, something measurable. Then there's rule utilitarianism, and this one establishes sets of rules, like it says right there in the name, that are designed to maximize happiness when generally followed. So the reason that there was this split is that there was a criticism, a common criticism of utilitarianism, that it seems a bit impractical to have to, calculate the total quantity, mathematical quantity of units of happiness or pleasure that would be produced prior to making coffee in the morning or any other action. Rule utilitarians address this by arguing that an act is right if and only if it follows from a rule that is part of a system of rules that produce the most good. So that may take care of that criticism, but there are other criticisms that remain of utilitarianism. I mean, first off, and sort of obviously, what should we make of selfish or immoral actions that just happen to produce desirable consequences? Stormtrooper fires a blaster at Luke and accidentally shoots Vader, unintentionally saving the galaxy. Did that stormtrooper perform a moral act? Or consider an example from Ursula K. Le Guin's short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. So this is a pretty common critique of utilitarianism, but Le Guin provides a really elegant sort of description of it. It's a great short story. It describes a utopian society where everyone is perpetually happy. It's this a society that has maximized happiness, but that happiness for the many depends upon the extreme suffering of a single innocent child. Now, from a strictly utilitarian perspective, this arrangement appears to be justified. The happiness of the many outweighs the suffering of one. If we're looking at the total quantity of happiness that is produced, then the situation described by Le Guin and The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas appears just. Yet I think most of us would intuitively reject this conclusion, which suggests that maybe, just maybe, utility alone is not the best measure of moral experience. So, if not utility, then what? Well, while utilitarians are focused on the outcomes of actions, on the consequences, Immanuel Kant, once again, is going to offer a different approach that grounds morality in the intentions of agents and what people intend when they act rather than the consequences of the actions. So, according to Kant, who you'll recall from Module 3 with Transcendental Idealism and the Analytic Synthetic Distinction, Kant's all over philosophy. I think he is officially the most cited philosopher in history. According to Kant, as rational beings, we have a duty to ensure that our actions conform to rational principles, right? So duty plays a major role in this, and ethical systems that are based on duty are referred to as deontological ethics, and deontological is a complicated word that just means duty-based, based on the performance of one's duty. And the commanding principle for Kant's version of deontological ethics, there's going to be commanding principles that constrain our action, and he's going to call these imperatives. Now, there's going to be two types of imperatives. Some imperatives are hypothetical. Hypothetical imperatives specify means for achieving particular ends. So, what does that mean? An example would be if you want a college degree, you ought to attend class. You should attend class. So, the attending of class is a means to the end of getting the degree. And these types of imperatives tend to be contextual and subjective. They only make sense within a certain context and according to a particular individual. They're not universal. But Kant's going to say that there's another type of imperative, the categorical imperative, which is universal. It binds all rational beings regardless of personal goals. A categorical imperative isn't a means to some other end. It's a moral end in itself. Now, Kant's going to present a number of formulations of the categorical imperative. He's going to say they're all the same. They're not. The most famous one is that one should act only according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. So, what does that mean? Imagine yourself to be a sort of universal moral lawgiver. And every action that you undertake effectively creates a moral law that everyone must follow. So if you break a promise, this act is going to birth a whole world of universal promise breaking. Now, according to Kant, such a world would contain what he calls a contradiction in conception. The very concept of a promise would be meaningless in a world where everyone breaks promises just standardly as a universal principle. What does a promise mean in that context? This is an internal contradiction in the structure of the world that renders the world itself logically inconceivable, according to Kant. And that's going to be his criteria to determine whether something conforms to reason, whether a moral principle conforms to reason, is whether it can be universalized. So in our readings, Honora O'Neill is going to discuss another formulation. It's a little bit more approachable of the categorical imperative, and it's known as the formula of the end in itself. So for Kant, rational beings, humans, are ends in themselves, right? We have inherent worth that isn't instrumental to anything else. We're an end rather than a means, rather than a tool or an instrument. And this is going to lead to his second formulation of the categorical imperative, which goes like this. Act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never as a means only. Now, this doesn't mean that we can never use others as means at all. I mean, we do this in ordinary cooperation all the time, but it means that we can't use other people, we can't reduce people to being simply means or merely means, because to do so denies their autonomy as rational agents by involving them in schemes which they couldn't possibly consent to, right? And again, it's the sort of thing that if you universalized would result in internal contradictions because it would apply to yourself as well. So we're going to return to Terry Pratchett here because there's another bit of dialogue from a different book. This one's from the book Carpe Jugulum. It's, again, part of the Discworld series, which is a huge series of books. But it does, honestly, a better job of describing Kant than Kant does.
And that's what your holy men discuss, is it? Not usually. There is a very interesting debate raging at the moment about the nature of sin, for example. And what do they think? Against it, are they? It's not as simple as that. It's not a black and white issue. There are so many shades of grey. Nope. Pardon? There's no greys, only white that's got grubby. I'm surprised you don't know that. And sin, young man, is when you treat people as things, including yourself. That's what sin is. It's a lot more complicated than that. No, it ain't. When people say things are a lot more complicated than that, they means they're getting worried that they won't like the truth. People as things. That's where it starts. Oh, I'm sure there's worse crimes. But they start with thinking about people as things.
From a Kantian perspective, treating people as things is the ultimate dereliction of moral duty, because it denies people their autonomy as rational agents. So while a utilitarian might justify harming one person to benefit many, Kantian ethics is going to forbid treating anyone as a mere means, regardless of any potential benefits that might result from the consequences. But don't good intentions sometimes lead to undesirable consequences? I mean, many of the bloodiest political revolutions have been built upon noble intentions, right? It's the old cliche about the road to hell being paved with good intentions and all that. Famously, Kant was challenged during his time with the following scenario. Let's say a murderer arrives at your door asking for the location of someone that's hidden inside. So you've hidden someone from the murderer. The murderer is there to kill the person that you've hidden and is at the door asking where the person is. Now, according to the categorical imperative, lying is impermissible. You can't lie, because then you'd be willing a universe in which everyone lied all the time, and then truth would be meaningless. So according to the categorical imperative, lying about the location of the murderer's intended victim is morally unjustified, even if the lie would save the life of an innocent person. And Kant actually bites the bullet here. You got to give him credit for consistency, and he agrees that you ought to answer the murderer truthfully and reveal the true location of the intended victim. That's the moral action, according to Kant. And for a lot of people, this results, this seems to indicate a deep flaw in Kant's system. So, where do we go from there then? I mean, maybe the whole project of looking for this like one-size-fits-all universal law or principle of ethical, objective ethical morality, maybe that's the wrong approach, right? Maybe learning a maxim, whether it's utilitarian or deontological, maybe that's not the same thing as performing a moral act. Well, that's where virtue ethics comes in. Virtue ethics is primarily associated with Plato's student Aristotle, who takes a different approach to this question. Virtue ethics focuses on developing a good character through habitual practice. It's very practice-based. Virtue is practical. Virtue takes practice. Like any skill, it's something that you have to train in order to perfect. Maybe virtue is not something that you learn, but instead something that you do. So Aristotle understands virtue essentially as a habit that you cultivate through intentional repetition of moral actions. You build up the habit by doing the moral thing in real life situations. And this process begins in childhood, when you observe other people who demonstrate good, virtuous moral behavior, and you copy that, and you start practicing that and make it habitual. And for Aristotle, this view of ethics is going to be grounded in what's called a teleological understanding of human nature and of the universe. Now, a theory is teleological if it explains things in terms of their purposes or goals, rather than their causes or inherent qualities. So according to Aristotle, all things have a purpose, or what he calls a telos. That's the Greek. And it's, for example, it's the purpose of a good knife to cut well, right? That knife is serving its purpose if it cuts well. But people also have a purpose in Aristotle's universe. Humans, us, we possess a rational soul. It's a combination of a rational soul. But for our purposes, humans possess a rational soul, a divine and self-sustaining spark that compels us to seek what's called eudaimonia, which is often translated as human flourishing or the good life. And we seek this through the effortless mastery of virtuous action. That's how we get it. That's how we attain the good life, eudaimonia. So we have to achieve this level, this flow state of effortless mastery of virtuous action. We don't even have to think about it. We just automatically know the correct proportions, the correct way to act. For humans, eudaimonia is the ultimate end in itself, right? It's complete, it's self-sustaining. All other goods, such as wealth or pleasure or honor or anything like that, they're valuable only to the extent that they contribute to human flourishing, to eudaimonia, to the good life. So how do we determine what a virtuous action is, then? For Aristotle, virtue typically represents a balanced middle ground between extremes of excess on one side and deficiency on the other side. And this is called the doctrine of the golden mean. So, for example, the virtue of courage lies between the vice of recklessness on one side and the vice of cowardice on the other. So you don't want to be completely reckless and just throw yourself into danger at the slightest provocation, but you don't want to, just cower in fear at the slightest thing either. You have to find the golden mean. You have to find the middle ground, the appropriate middle ground that fits the situation. And the virtuous person is someone who recognizes the appropriate balance between these extremes needed for every situation. Now, not all vices can be made virtuous just by sort of tweaking their degree, right? There's no proportion of adultery or murder that's going to turn out virtuous. So it's not something that universalizes. And eudaimonia is not the sort of thing that you achieve by following a universal rule. So he's getting away from this conception. This precedes Mill and Kant. But it's different. It's very practice-based. It's very, very situationally based. And you achieve eudaimonia not by following some abstract universal rule. You achieve it by building character, by becoming the sort of person that doesn't need to follow rules in order to behave virtuously, right? Someone who's virtuous in Aristotle's sense would have no use for the utilitarian calculus or the categorical imperative. Navigating the golden mean requires developing what's called phronesis, which is the Greek for practical wisdom. And every individual must determine what the appropriate balance is, what the golden mean is, what this balance is between the extremes of excess and deficiency for every particular situation. It's never going to be the same. You can't universalize it. It's always going to be messy and something that is based on the individual and the circumstances. So Julia Driver, in our readings, is going to note that there's one criticism of virtue ethics is that there's a certain kind of unhelpful circularity involved in saying that virtue consists in acting like a person who is virtuous, right? A definition like this risks begging the question that it claims to answer, to get back to the fallacy of begging the question once again. And when virtues conflict, when two virtues come into conflict, there's no clear criteria that's provided by virtue ethics for determining how to make a decision in that case. Now, the virtue ethicist is going to respond to this by saying that vagueness is a feature, not a bug. That's the point. Moral excellence precisely consists in this ability to skillfully navigate the genuine nuance and complexity of real-life moral dilemmas. The real world is messy. You're not going to find out the correct way to navigate moral problems by adhering to some universal rule. You're going to have to figure it out case by case and build up a habit of being able to make that determination habitually. And that's what building character and becoming a virtuous person is. from an Aristotelian perspective. So let's look at the ethics of care, which is similar to virtue ethics in a lot of ways, but it's a more recent framework that is similarly based on practical engagement with the world rather than sort of abstract rule following. And this position in our readings is represented by Virginia Held, and she's written many articles, but in our readings for Module 6 and 7, there's going to be 2 articles by her that represent portions of this larger philosophical project that she has, which challenges a number of the assumptions that we take for granted regarding human nature in its normative sense, which is what sort of nature humans ought to have, right? So Held is going to position her critique as is going to position her ethics as a critique of traditional theories that have tended to approach moral agents as if they were these disembodied Cartesian knowers, right? Rational and autonomous agents negotiating for mastery over their individual destinies. So in her view, this misses the deeply embodied and relational nature of human moral experience. We don't enter the world as isolated agents, making these detached, rational calculations, summing up the quantity of pleasure versus pain of any individual action. Instead, we emerge as vulnerable, embodied beings who are always already embedded in reciprocal networks of care and dependency. And Held means care in 2 senses here. She means it as the practice of physically caring for someone, like a parent cares for a child, and in the feeling of emotionally caring about other people. So it's what William James would call a double-barreled term. Parents care for their children not because of some abstract moral calculus, but because of the embodied emotional bonds and relationships, right? And Held suggests these caring relationships aren't just peripheral to morality. They aren't something that's ancillary that shouldn't be taken into consideration, but they're constitutive of its foundations. They're central to what it means to be a moral or ethical agent. And this is some of this may sound familiar because it's an extension of the sort of reasoning that went into the 4E model of cognition and agency that we talked about in modules 4 and 5, but applied now to ethics. So if you recall, the 4E model of cognition and agency is that cognition and agency are embodied, embedded, extended, and enactive. And this Held's position places ethics also within a similar framework, where practical ethics is similarly grounded in the embodied, embedded, extended, and enactive situatedness of already existing webs of human interrelation. So this is a few ways to approach the moral realist position. So what about the moral anti-realist? What are they up to? So let's wrap up by briefly looking at a few critiques from the moral anti-realists of moral realism. So James Rachels, who we're reading for this module, considers 2 challenges from what he calls moral egoism. The first one comes from what he calls psychological egoism, which is the claim that genuine altruism, genuinely caring about others and acting in a way that is other-directed, that prioritizes the interests of others over yourself, is a myth. It's not real. It's not a thing. It's impossible. All actions, even seemingly selfless ones, are ultimately grounded in self-interest. Everything bottoms out in self-interest. Everything we do, even if it appears to be altruistic, it's ultimately selfish. That's psychological egoism. There's a stronger version that Rachels is going to talk about called ethical egoism, which makes a stronger normative claim. Psychological egoism is a descriptive claim. Ethical egoism is going to make the normative claim that people ought to act in their self-interest, regardless of whether altruism is possible, that people should act out of self-interest instead of out of altruism. The only person I can think of offhand who promotes something like this is perhaps Ayn Rand. Anyway, egoism suggests that morality can never be anything beyond this sort of sophisticated mask for self-interest. At the end of the day, we are all acting out of our own self-interest. So that's moral egoism. Moral subjectivism, which Julia Driver is going to talk about, reduces moral claims to personal feelings or attitudes rather than objective facts. And this kind of gets back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this lecture. So when we say that genocide is wrong, we're not making an objective claim about the world. We're merely stating a psychological fact about ourselves, that we personally disapprove of genocide. That's it. And that's going to vary. Objective facts stay the same. They don't vary person to person. Whereas moral facts, according to the moral subjectivist, are going to vary from individual to individual. There's going to be no universal standard. And Driver's going to critique this position in the readings. She doesn't talk about moral expressivism, which is a more recent and more sophisticated version of this that I think actually evades most, if not all, of her critiques from the reading. Moral expressivism is a version of moral subjectivism, or a development of moral subjectivism that develops this thread further by suggesting that moral statements don't actually represent factual claims at all. They're merely these sort of non-cognitive expressions of personal distaste. So when you say that genocide is wrong, basically you're not even making a sort of logical or cognitive claim, statement, proposition about the world. You're just basically kind of going genocide, ugh. And so that's moral expressivism. Then on to cultural relativism. Now, to the cultural relativist, the notion that there is some objective realm of moral truth that transcends nature, culture, and history appears to be obviously false, if not absurd. Evaluations regarding the morality of other cultures are always going to presuppose the moral standpoint of our own culture, because you cannot step outside of culture to critique culture. There is no what Richard Rorty would call permanent neutral matrix, or what's sometimes called the view from nowhere, or the God's eye view, that you can just step out of your situatedness and time, place, and history, and all of that sort of thing, culture, in order to dispassionately make an evaluation that isn't shaped by the culture that you were born into. No observation under this view is ever truly objective. The cultural embeddedness of observers will always shape their perception of facts. Now, Mary Migley is going to critique a particularly strong form of this view that she calls moral isolationism, which makes an even stronger claim that cultural morals are ultimately incommensurable, which means they cannot even be shared or communicated or understood across cultural boundaries. Now, when you read this, and I think this would be a great paper idea, no one's taken me up on this yet, but comparing Migley's critique of moral isolationism with Uma Narayan's notion of double vision from Module 3. Now, Narayan talks about the positionality of marginalized groups requiring that they inhabit the cultural narratives of their own group in addition to the cultural narrative of the dominant group simultaneously, right? The dominant class, however, doesn't have the ability to similarly inhabit the cultural knowledge of the marginalized class because they aren't situated within the necessary epistemic context. They have there's nothing forcing them to take on that perspective. So there is this epistemic gap that opens up, right? In the moral knowledge that is shared between the two groups, between the dominant and the marginalized group. And that, I think, is an effective response, perhaps, to Migley's critique. So I encourage anyone who's looking for paper ideas to maybe look at some of our topics through the lens of of a potential dialogue between Migley and Narayan in this case. And as Susan Wolf points out, who wants to be a moral saint anyway? Wolf is going to provide us with, I think, a much-needed reality check about the goal of becoming the greatest possible moral agent, the perfect moral agent. And she's going to do this by describing two models of moral saints. There's the utilitarian, loving saint, whose happiness consists entirely in other people's happiness. And then you have, on the other hand, the deontological, rational saint, who dutifully sacrifices their personal desires for moral demands. And as Wolf is going to point out, neither of these moral saints would seem like they're going to have a lot of time for things like literature, art, humor, hobbies, music, any of that sort of thing. They don't sound like they're going to be particularly fun or interesting people to be, much less to be around. Life is filled with goods beyond the moral, is Wolf's point, and that we'd be impoverished if we neglected them in pursuit of this sort of moral perfection. So, I think that's a good place to wrap up the lecture on ethics. In our next and final lecture, we're going to broaden the ethical lens to consider the concepts of justice at the social scale. So we're going to look at social justice more broadly considered. For this module, Module 6, you have one quiz, and that's it. And that's because we need to start thinking about our final papers and looking towards that. So I hope this was useful, and I'll see you next time.